Welcome to the Rise of the Moderate podcast, episode 3. On today's episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about about this notion that we need to make America great again, that somehow our great days are in the past, and kind of lost our fastball, and we need to reclaim our glory. This sentiment that Donald Trump rode to the White House. But before I get to that, I'd like to discuss something that I've been kind of dealing with, and I wonder how many of you may have been dealing with the same thing recently. I haven't updated the podcast or really done much with the website in the last month or so. Now there were the holidays during that time, and that was a welcome distraction from the impending Donald Trump presidency. But I also, beyond the holidays, I also found myself, for the first time in my life, kind of avoiding news, kind of trying to just stay away from the news, not read headlines, just because there's this feeling of, this feeling that the country's coming apart. And, I know as somebody who follows politics, you feel kind of powerless and frustrated. And me personally, I feel stress, depression. It's just, it's painful to see what's happening in this country. So for the first time in my life, I found myself avoiding the news. And if you knew me, you know just how unusual this is. I have been kind of a politics and news junkie since my earliest memories. I mean, as a kid, I'm old enough to remember coverage of the Ford and Carter election in 76, when I was probably 7 or 8 years old. I mean, I knew who Anwar Sadat was and Menachem Begin during the Egyptian and Israeli negotiations with Jimmy Carter. That's because my father, he'd come home from work, and every night it was a priority to sit down, and for him to sit down and watch the evening news. It was also a priority for him to read the newspaper, and I was able to, I guess that in a way fed my passion for news. And since that time I've always been a news junkie. Never ever in my life have I shied away from news. I've always tried to be informed, but it's hard to stomach what's happening in this country. And as I said, there's a feeling of powerlessness that comes with it. So I decided to just stay offline and avoid news and focus on my family life and my work. But that's not a solution to this. I mean, all of us, we shouldn't be retreating from the news. We should be more active and more involved and more vocal than ever before. And I think that's especially true for moderates. I mean, vocal moderates are the biggest threat to the alt-right and the extreme conservative movement. On online debates that you often see on social media, conservatives, they find it easy to dismiss liberals as liberals and call them names that, I won't repeat them here, but they're not kind. But when conservatives encounter moderates, it seems like they don't know what to do. They don't know how to react. Their paper-thin arguments begin to dissolve, and they can't just dismiss us as mindless liberals, and they kind of crumble. So I think moderates are the only group right now that can truly change the course of our nation for the better. The problem is moderates are generally quieter than the left and right counterparts. They're more analytical, contemplative, and that doesn't get much attention in the news. The news gets dominated by louder liberals and conservatives, and therefore people of this country think that all the issues are just a matter of liberal versus conservative, and it's not. And we need to change that, and change that by having a voice and by getting involved, no matter how small and how insignificant that is. So instead of avoiding news and the problems our country now faces, we all need to do our part. And I guess this podcast and website are my part, even if it is just an insignificant drop in the bucket. So I'll be yelling out for moderates, whether anyone listens or not. And that yelling today, that's going to be about this notion that we need to make America great again, that America's greatest days are in the past, and we need to make ourselves great again. So I feel like the country right now, kind of like an ex-athlete or an ex-rock star who once did amazing things and the world looked to, but we don't feel like we're doing anything amazing anymore. And we're having this existential crisis about that. America is having a midlife crisis. We're thinking about what we were what we were like in our 20s, essentially. If that we used to be this beautiful country that was able to do amazing things, and we're not anymore. And so what have we done? We've turned to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is our trophy wife or our sports car. He's our emotional kind of knee-jerk reaction to this feeling that we might not be at our best anymore. Now, if you're familiar with American history, this idea that our glory days are behind us and our greatest days are behind us, in a way, it's kind of understandable. I mean, right from day one in the founding of our democracy, we were something revolutionary, something that changed the course of this world. I mean, this idea that you have a system of government where adversaries come together, and instead of fighting for power, literally fighting for power, they discussed and debated issues and then reached a compromise. It's so easy to take that for granted nowadays. But it was completely revolutionary. And people around the world have since then looked to America as a source of inspiration. Our founders also created a free society. I mean, they set up a free press. They protected freedom of religion. And said we all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our system of government and the principles that our founding fathers created have been a beacon of hope for all of humanity. So, right from day one, we were a pretty big deal. Now I'll spare you the American history lesson. We rose from 13 colonies to spread across the country, and of course during that growth there's that ecstasy of growth, that things were getting bigger and better all the time. We did amazing things, like we were the first humans to take flight. And in the span of one lifetime, from that moment where we took flight, we went and put a man on the moon. That's a pretty big deal. But I think our peak, our greatest days, as I think some people like to reflect on it, well, I think that was came during and the years following World War II. I think that was our pinnacle moment. You had the biggest war in history, and it was an undeniably good war in a way. From our standpoint, it was pure. It was as pure a war of good versus evil as you will ever see in history. We didn't attack. We were attacked. And then we defended ourselves against not one, but two imperial and, quite frankly, downright evil empires. I mean, we all know about the Nazis and about the Holocaust and how evil they were. I think Americans are less familiar with how brutal the Japanese were and the horrible, horrible things that they did in places like China and Korea and the Philippines. And so we fought not one, but two mighty powers at the same time. I mean, when the Nazis were taking over Europe, Europe was crumbling. He had taken over almost all of Europe. He had waded deep into Russia. He was bombarding Britain, and the British were brave in their resistance. But even Churchill knew that Churchill was trying desperately to convince Roosevelt. I mean, the Brits were on their last legs. And then we came in and we fought two enemies at once, two mighty enemies at once, and we won. That's pretty, that'll make you feel pretty good at the end of the day. Like you're a pretty big deal. Now, after World War I, the rest of the Western world was in shambles. Europe was a mess. And we stood alone as a country that was basically unscathed by this war, and while the rest of the world was trying to rebuild. So our economy, it was kind of a boom. It was a boom time for our economy, but when you look at it, it was kind of an anomaly. It was because we stood alone as the only nation that was as a great power that was relatively unscathed by World War II. And it took years, decades for Europe to recover. So yeah, it's easy to look back on that time and say, America used to be great. Whatever happened to us? But this idea that America is always going to stand alone, it's ignorant of history, and it's not realistic. The rest of the world was going to catch up. And yeah, we're not slaying dragons anymore, or at least not right now. We're not fighting these mighty wars. And you look at history, World War II itself was kind of an anomaly. You usually don't have such a clear-cut good versus evil. Wars are pretty messy. So yeah, it's easy to look back on that time period as this golden age for America. And this idea that we can go back to that, it's unrealistic. So now what? Does that mean we're not a great country anymore because we're not alone at the top, or we other countries are catching up? I mean, we still have the greatest economy on the planet. It's got some weaknesses to it. We're still the greatest military power on the planet. And most of all, we're still a beacon of hope. I know we've had our imperfections and we've had our troubles, but make no mistake, the rest of the world looks to America as a beacon of hope, because if it wasn't for us, you have these authoritarian regimes in Russia and China, and you take us out of the equation, and the world is a much darker, frightening, terrible place. So the world still looks to us for our principles of freedom. They're still looking to us to face down tyranny in containing Russia and China, and we do. America is great. We're great. Today we are just as great as we always were. The situation is a little different. And yeah, we may be a little bit more matured. We may have a little gray on our hair, and may go to bed at a more reasonable hour. But we're still the greatest country on earth. It's not even close. Now, because of this insecurity, we've elected a man who threatens all that. A man who preyed on our kind of midlife insecurity. And he threatens our very leadership status in the world. Diplomacy and international relations are complex, and Americans haven't paid much attention to it in 30 years. Since Gorbachev came into the picture, and we didn't feel quite as threatened by the Soviet Union. We've had our wars, but in terms of the complexities of international policy, Americans have turned their back on foreign affairs for the most part. And that's going to come back to haunt us if we don't contain Trump himself. Donald Trump is a simpleton. He cannot grasp complex issues. He's demonstrated this. And he certainly can't grasp what American greatness looks like in the 21st century. But maybe he represents a tipping point. Maybe we'll look back on this time as a moment when the true greatness of America once again took center stage as our nation rejected and stopped our tyrant president. Can only hope so. Thanks for listening. Please check us out at our website, riseofthemoderates.com. Like us on Facebook. That would be, we need to get the message out. And like us on Facebook at facebook.com/riseofthemoderates. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at riseofmoderates. Also, please share the podcast, share our news articles. Go to iTunes and give us a good review. I guess I don't know much about podcasting, but the word on the street is that helps quite a bit. So thanks for listening.